Hi, everyone, and welcome to this special seminar. We've taken the opportunity for Dr. Sepali Kottegoda to come to London, and we were like, oh, she can come here. And so Dr. Sepali is a founder member of the Women's in Media Collective. She is currently the Director of Programs, Gender and Political Economy and Media. Sepali actually received her MPhil and her DPhil from here at IDS, and so it's a really great honor to work with her on this. And also just to say that Sepali has extensive research publications, including in the areas of unpaid care work, gender pay gap, women in poverty, etc. This seminar is being hosted by the Sustaining Power program, which is basically looking at women's rights across 4 countries in South Asia, which is India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka is not part of that particular study, but we're really hoping that we can bring some joint learning together, and so really honored to invite Dr. Kottegoda to the stage, and you're going to be able to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll take some questions and comments. Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Over to you.
I don't need to do anything to this, right? I can keep it here. Okay. So thank you very much for coming to this session. And I really want to thank Deepta for popping this suggestion that if I do come this way again, to please come and I can share some of my learnings from Sri Lanka. I also want to thank the Asia Foundation in Colombo in Sri Lanka, because they stepped in to enable me to route my return from New York via London so that I could come and be with you all. So my research in Sri Lanka from a socio-anthropological sort of perspective has really helped me deepen my understanding on the issue, specifically in the Sri Lankan context. So by approaching the subject in this lens, I can see the broader significance of looking at unpaid care work, but also from a political economy framework. I'm not a political economist. I'm a product basically of IDS, and has over the years accumulated, I suppose, broadened my knowledge in certain areas. And I want to use the lens of social reproduction, because to me, when I actually started reading on social reproduction, I realized that it's actually capturing much of the aspects of unpaid care work in the country and brought it into a more cohesive kind of framing that I am beginning to be more comfortable with. So the structural inequalities that define women's unpaid care work are often invisible, and we know that, but indispensable. I thought it's better to understand this within this framework. So I came across this quote from Meg Luxton from 2006. This is the reason why I thought I should actually do this initial examination of unpaid care work in the context of Sri Lanka's welfare state. She, quote to quote, even when social democratic welfare states provide extensive services and programs to support the population, they are always based on the assumption that families are available to provide the essentials. So, unquote. So this underscores a fundamental tension in state welfare structures, one that assumes the availability of familial care without adequately compensating or recognizing the labor involved. So terms such as care, caregiving, paid work, unpaid care work, and the care economy have increasingly gained prominence in academic research, policy, and discourse, and gender-sensitive economic analysis over the past few decades. But their inclusion in policy discussions remains uneven across different contexts. And in Sri Lanka, these terms are only recently being acknowledged as essential components of women's economic participation and broader socio-economic, political inclusion. Actually, in Sri Lanka, while we were doing our work at Women and Media on unpaid care work, the first key factor was tabled in Parliament in 2020 by a newly elected member of the National People's Power Party, Dr. Harini Amrasuri, in 2020. She is now the Prime Minister of the country, elected with a historical large personal vote. So I believe that for all of us who are interested in the issue of women's labor, women's economic participation, and recognition of unpaid care work, in Sri Lanka, that is a very positive factor. So her intervention actually did mark a crucial step in bringing unpaid care work into the realm of political discourse, acknowledging it as a key determinant of women's access to formal employment and economic security. But the concept of care remains deeply gendered. Caregiving responsibilities are intrinsically tied to gendered expectations about who is responsible for maintaining the well-being of household members. These, in turn, are shaped by social norms that position women as primary caregivers. So, alongside their direct biological function in reproduction, women are expected to fulfill a nurturing role within the household, assuming responsibilities that extend far beyond childbirth. So, they also ensure that food is put on the table, they maintain social and community relationships, and uphold the household's overall well-being. Then there are the people who are in paid care work, paid domestic work. Women who are employed in others' households and receive remuneration. Their wages remain consistently undervalued, and the justification for this undervaluation is deeply rooted in normative assumptions because this type of work is seen as a natural extension. And I recall once, some years ago, I was at a meeting, a study on migrant women and from Sri Lanka, they go as domestic workers. And one male head of a trade union said, "What is this? He said, they do this at home, but he was a person who was supposed to be a trade unionist looking at the rights of women migrant domestic workers. But that attitude, I think, is very deep-seated. So the systematic undervaluation of domestic and care work reflects a broader reality, one in which women's labor is both essential and invisible. Now, when I look at social reproduction and situating care work within this political economy perspective, what women are expected to do, and in practice what they almost inevitably end up doing, is social reproduction. It refers to the process of maintaining and reproducing people, particularly the laboring population. Social reproduction includes provisioning food, clothing, knowledge transmission, and the inculcation of social values. This is from Bazanson and Luxton from their publication in 2006. And the concept of social reproduction comes from a Marxist feminist framework. So on the political economy of women's labor in particular, domestic labor. Against this backdrop, I want to look at how the discourse on social reproduction is reflected in the formulation of social protection policies in Sri Lanka. I want to explore the question, how does the state define the family, household, and women in its programs aimed at poverty alleviation, disability welfare, and elderly care? This is significant because in Sri Lanka, social welfare has historically been positioned as a central component of state policy. The country is often cited as an example of a welfare state, particularly due to a long-standing commitment to provide free education and healthcare. And since independence, Sri Lanka has maintained a reputation for relatively strong social welfare provisions, and in principle do not discriminate on the basis of gender in areas of education and healthcare. But the exception, of course, to this universal social welfare rollout was the period of the 30-year war, ethnic conflict and war in Sri Lanka, when the state social welfare was greatly reduced in areas of the country that were partially under outside government control. So while the Sri Lanka's welfare system appears comprehensive on the surface, its practical implementation reveals gaps, particularly in relation to gender equity. The assumption that families, particularly women, will step in to fill the care gaps remain deeply ingrained in policy design. Now, while state-supported safety nets include pension and financial support for the elderly, these measures primarily target individuals rather than addressing the broader care structures within which they exist. So, let me just say something about the welfare state now. Sri Lanka is often looked at, particularly in the South Asian context, as an exemplary country where social welfare has been an integral component of state policy since independence in 1948. The government has maintained free education, healthcare. We have had subsidized government transport services, and no overt discrimination. Girls and boys go to school, men, and there's really no difference unless they are from areas of the country where the education facilities are not as well resourced, and men and women can access healthcare anywhere in the country. Again, the caveat is some healthcare services in some parts of the country may not be as well resourced. So we also, the social safety nets encompass several forms of financial assistance, including pensions and payments for the elderly and for persons with disability. But it's, I think, useful to look at this seemingly smooth subsuming of the politics of social reproduction into informing of and framing of welfare policies related to poverty alleviation and the family care within the family-based household. So I wanted to look at the recent national level poverty indicators and attempt to link these with some of the findings from research on unpaid care work and the gender pay gap and the ongoing debates on inclusion and exclusion of gender in the formation of state programs. So just to give a little background, the 2021 census, we had 22.2 million population, 10.7 million men, and 11.4 million women. This demographic breakdown is important because to see also the age distribution. The population over 60 years comprised right now, at least in 2021, 16.4%. Children in the age cohort 0 to 4 made up 15.9%, and youth population between 15 and 24 accounted for 14.8. So the highest is the persons over 60 years of age. Then when we look at the labor force participation in 2022, male labor force participation was 70.5%, that is 5.5 million, while female was 32.1% or 2.9 million labor force participation. The percentage of economically active individuals was 65% for men and 34% for women. Conversely, in the economically inactive category, men accounted for 27.1%, whereas women made up 72.6%. So looking deeper into the reasons behind these figures, we find the disproportionately high representation of women in the economically inactive category which is largely attributable to unpaid care work. These women, the economically inactive, of the 72.6% of women who are economically inactive, 58 are categorized as engaged in housework, whereas only 4.1% of men are categorized as engaged in housework. Now, let's come a little more recent context. In Sri Lanka, we went through a very severe economic crisis during the period 2020-2023. The Sri Lankan rupee collapsed by 300%, literally exploding living costs. There was a very rapid rise in cost of all basic living needs and amenities, including transport, food, medicine, clothing, schooling needs, etc. Economic hardships reached unprecedented levels, with indicators reflecting widespread financial distress. So in 2023, some 100,000 households had their electricity cut because they were unable to pay the bills. Children began dropping out of school or attending school irregularly, because parents did not have the funds to put them in the school vans, buy their books, clothes, etc. And many women were pushed further into the informal sector, while others found themselves unable to secure employment that provided a stable or living wage. Now, our study on the gender pay gap, we had interviews with different women from different categories of paid work. And in one case, it was a single mother from the urban areas working in the free trade zone, a garment factory. She had little support, access to support services or to supportive social networks. So what did she do? Just one example, but there are many. She left her free trade zone factory job and took up work in a manpower agency, right? So on the one hand, these agencies provide women some degree of flexibility, and if she's unable to report for duty on a given day, she had the option of foregoing that day's wages and going into the pool the next day. But on the other hand, it comes with significant costs. Manpower agencies do not offer job security, nor do they contribute to long-term financial protections such as the Employment Provident Fund. Women employed through these agencies are left without stable income, social security, or the legal protection afforded by the formal sector. So that's what was happening in terms of employment and living, the crisis and living costs, and the lack of support services for women to take up paid work on a regular basis. The impact of Sri Lanka's economic downturn, poverty, which had been 11.3% in 2019, rose to 12.7% in 2020, and by 2022 had reached 25%, with an additional 2.5 million classified as impoverished. It also had serious ramifications for maternal child nutrition. Pregnant and lactating mothers and had been particularly affected. Due to the rising food prices, households, including both poor and middle-class households, families were forced to reduce their intake of protein-rich foods like eggs, fish, and meat. So in that context, we had the multidimensional poverty index carried out in Sri Lanka. So which is a framework that helps us understand poverty beyond mere income measurements. It considers multiple dimensions of deprivation that affect an individual's well-being. So rather than solely relying on income thresholds to determine poverty levels, the multidimensional poverty index identified education, health, standard of living, and child development. These dimensions had at least 12 indicators: years of schooling, access to health facilities, etc., availability of drinking water, housing conditions, and early childhood development. So based on these indications, 1 in every 6 Sri Lankans, 16%, was classified as multidimensionally poor. The elderly aged 65 and over constituted the poorest demographic group. The highest levels of deprivation were observed in access to healthcare, cooking fuel, drinking water, and basic household facilities. So the intersection between multidimensional poverty and gender remains a crucial aspect of this discussion. Women, particularly those in caregiving roles, face compounded vulnerabilities. They are more likely to face deprivation and of multiple dimensions. Again, another study, more recent one from UNDP on household debt, found because household debt in Sri Lanka has increased exponentially in recent years. 33.4% of Sri Lankan households grapple with multidimensional vulnerability. Many households are forced to resort to borrowing to cover basic consumption, education, transport, and medical expenses. To meet income needs, this is what's very interesting for me. Families frequently turn to pawning jewelry or selling personal belongings. So the growing debt crisis highlights a fundamental issue in Sri Lanka's economic structure. The study defined a household with a debt problem as one where borrowing is used to sustain basic necessities rather than investment or financial stability. So among these households, 31.1% rely on pawning assets. 24% turn to informal moneylenders, 23.5% borrow from banks. So while these figures reflect widespread economic distress, they also raise an important question. Who within the household is responsible for pawning jewelry or liquidating assets? The UNDP report disaggregates its data by province and by urban and rural areas. While it does not acknowledge directly the gendered aspect of financial vulnerability, it proposes strengthening social safety nets through expanding social protection measures for the working population and includes informal sector workers and women. And it also proposes providing urgent cash transfers targeting women through maternal and child health clinics. Again, cash transfers through maternal and child health clinics, we have to understand that that is women's reproductive identity. It's not does not necessarily have women who may not have children or don't have children that go to the clinics. So Sri Lanka's welfare policies, while comprehensive relatively, are fundamentally shaped by traditional concepts of the family. The very structure of welfare programs assumes a particular model of household composition, one that is both gendered and heteronormative. We had, which is 2010, but it's from the Institute of Health Sciences, a definition of the family. The family, this is a quote, the family as the basic unit of society performs many functions in the development and well-being of its members. Families share resources, care for their members, including children, the elderly, and the disabled, and offer a nurturing environment to children in ways no other institution can necessarily provide. Family equates family with women, basically, because that's everything that is there in this definition is what women are expected to do, but it's labeled under a definition on family. Family is treated as a stable, harmonious unit. It's not unusual. Everywhere we find this notion that family is a harmonious unit, where caregiving is assumed to be a natural function of women's role within the household. The dominant framework also presumes the existence of a household head, typically recognized as an adult male. This presumption directly influences how welfare benefits are distributed and who is considered the primary beneficiary of a family unit. While there is no formal policy or regulation that the adult senior male is the head of the household, in practice socially, taking guidance from the official census categories used by government population enumerators, a male household head is identified as the head of the household. This somewhat incongruous adherence to a gendered concept was evidenced in my personal life, because when the census enumerators turned up at my house, I was not there. My husband had said, I am the head of the household. And they had looked at him with disbelief and tried to convince him that he is the head of the house. So, okay. So, to look at social protection, now the welfare state, as I said earlier, was inherited by the British colonial government in 1948. And we had, at that time, in the post-war world and post-war recently independent Ceylon, the universal ration card system, which provided all households with access to basic food supplies. In the 1970s, the universal welfare model underwent a fundamental shift. Government replaced the ration card with a targeted household income scheme, effectively changing the focus of state welfare from universal entitlement to needs-based or income-based as allocation. So we have had the food stamp scheme. Then it went, these are all poverty alleviation programs of different names under different governments. Food stamps, Janasavya, Samurdhi, and the most recent is Aswasuma. While these programs aim to provide financial relief, their effectiveness remains questionable, particularly in how they define eligibility criteria. So more recent, when assisting eligibility, household income is, as a collective unit, the presumed equitable distribution of resources within the family. Those are two fundamental assumptions in the poverty alleviation programs. The most recent program is Aswasuma. It was formulated with the support of the World Bank, has emphasized targeted selection of beneficiaries based on the findings of the multidimensional poverty index. While we agree, the MPI is useful in assessing poverty levels, it doesn't necessarily account for gendered realities of economic vulnerability. Now, Verite Research, a Sri Lankan think tank, argues this, saying the MPI is useful when you look at welfare assistance. It falls through the cracks. But what is concerning is the fact that the criterion used so far has failed to address the drastic increase in levels of household poverty resulting from the economic crisis, when prices increased by more than 46%, and World Bank estimates that poverty levels will remain 25%, around 25% in the next few years. Now, when I want to bring this discussion into looking at the persons with disability and how the state responds to the population of persons with disability. There is a disability allowance. We have a National Secretariat for Persons with Disabilities and a National Police for Disability. Sri Lanka has signed and ratified the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, reflecting its commitment to ensuring disability rights. One of the key provisions in the policy on disability is the government's disability allowance, which provides financial support for persons with disabilities. Currently, individuals with disabilities whose income is below 3,000 rupees a month are entitled to receive a disability allowance. The 2025 budget, which this new government has put in, proposes an increase in the allowance from 7,500 to 10,000 rupees. While this increase is a positive step, it remains insufficient when considering the real costs associated with disability care. A critical gap is the failure to acknowledge the unpaid care work performed by family members, overwhelmingly women, who provide daily assistance to persons with disability. So while even the 10,000 rupees is not enough for medical, transport, other essential needs, the financial aid is directed at the disabled individual. There is no structured policy or support mechanism for the caregiver who ensures their well-being. We look at elder care. There's an allowance. Sri Lanka, but in this context, Sri Lanka is undergoing significant demographic shift, with its aging population projected to rise to approximately 25% of the total population by around 2030. Women on average have a longer life expectancy than men, living up to about 85 years compared to 78 years for men. This longevity gap presents unique challenges as elderly women are more likely to experience financial insecurity in their later years. The state provides citizens allowance for those aged 70 and above whose income is less than 3,000. But the financial support is low. It is 2,000 rupees a month now, and it will be increased to 5,000 rupees. While these may seem like improvements, it is still wholly inadequate for meeting the cost of living. Many elderly women, particularly widows, lack independent sources of income and rely on extended family members for financial and emotional support. Absence of a comprehensive pension scheme for security, informal sector workers, in addition to those elderly, where women are significantly represented, exacerbates the financial vulnerability of older women. So when you look at it through a social reproduction lens, it becomes evident that social protection programs for the elderly, as for those of persons with disability, continue to overlook a key dimension, the unpaid care labor and unpaid labor. Who provides daily assistance to elderly individuals or persons with disabilities? Who ensures they receive medical attention? The answer is, of course, more often than not, women. So while the state may allocate financial resources, it doesn't compensate or formally recognize the labor performed by caregivers. And increasingly, they will be elderly women themselves, as we are aging. So the social welfare subsidy scheme has, to some degree, served to subsume some of the critical social reproductive dynamics within the large family, since social protection reduced social vulnerabilities to a certain extent. So in this sense, Sri Lanka compared better with the deprivations suffered in most other developing countries. But as the social welfare systems were progressively downgraded and directed to market-based delivery of social survival needs, that is, removal of state subsidies, reliance on market supply, the issue of care within the family and households become more prominent. And since the economic crisis and the collapse of the rupee and the sharp rise in levels of poverty, we really need to look at scrutinize more what the intra-household dynamics are and how the well-being of the family members are being met. So where's the clock? Oh, okay, 5 minutes. The critical parameter that keeps eluding these assessments and proposals to address poverty through state welfare programs is the gender responsive parameter or lens. So Sri Lanka's welfare programs rely on narrowly defined indicators to determine poverty alleviation programs, especially on determining eligibility. And the indicators really continuously, I have to stress, fail to capture the structural inequalities embedded in social and economic life. And I want to now bring in as part of Sri Lanka's commitment to the SDGs, SDG 5, it carried out, the Department of Census and Statistics carried out the first ever time use survey in 2017, which was published in 2020. That found that on average, women spent 5.7 hours per day on unpaid housework and caregiving, and compared to 1.6 by men. My organization, the Women and Media Collective, carried out not an island-wide survey, but from six districts, and when we included all unpaid housework and care and voluntary activities, we found that women spent 13.7 hours to 8.9 by men. When we looked at the caregivers of persons with disabilities, because most often we focus on the policy focuses on the persons with disabilities, but they do not look at the person or persons who look after these individuals within the home. We found that women spend 91.3% of their time and men spend 8.8% of their time looking after the well-being of a family member of persons with disabilities. So there is a stark contrast, and it's very clear when we were doing this research, the isolation of the persons who are looking after, the individuals who are looking after family members with disabilities. So I think unpaid care work is not just an individual or familial concern, it's a foundational element of the state welfare state. Without the time, energy, and skills invested by women, and to a lesser extent by men, social protection programs would be ineffective in delivering meaningful support. So I think it's important that we understand the power dynamics that shape social reproduction, the way in which they are deeply tied to existing hierarchies of gender, class, and economic status. And I found this study by Thiagalingam and Johnston in 2024 on depletion and in relation to social reproduction. So they discuss the concept of depletion through social reproduction, particularly in conflict-affected environments. The framework they use is useful in examining how economic and social crises impact caregivers. They argue that resources available in any given society to sustain human well-being must be understood as a balance between inflows, such as medical care, education, and support networks, and outflows, such as time spent on unpaid care work, domestic work, and community responsibilities. So applying this framework to Sri Lanka's ongoing economic crisis is useful because it brings out the fact that who has been most disproportionately affected in households. During the last few years of economic instability, women in low-income households faced extreme depletion, and as they absorb the financial and emotional stress. So I want to end with I want to just put in a case study we had while the economic crisis, in the middle of it, we went to different districts to speak with women. And this is just a story of one woman. Damayanti is a 40-year-old woman living with her husband, who was 42, and 3 daughters. Her youngest daughter receives a government-provided school meal consisting of rice, greens, vegetables, and occasionally dry fish gravy. However, egg portions previously included are no longer available. To compensate, Damayanti prepares a simple meal, rice meal for her older daughters, reserving limited protein for the youngest child, which means they would cook some sprats or heads of sprats in a curry, and the youngest child would get the actual protein. Their economic hardship started with the COVID pandemic. Now they have cut down on their meals to the point that any protein, such as dry fish, is brought only for this child. And they used to buy milk, fresh milk from a nearby farm, but now the price is too high. She used to do more gardening for vegetables, but she has to cut down because they used to pump and the electricity costs have gone up. So I think it's crucial that we recognize unpaid care work not as a marginal issue. It is central to the functioning of society, and we now have a focus on unpaid care work, but we need to actually direct policy, because a lot of the policy is, if we do talk about unpaid care work, it's about providing child care, disability care, and elder care. But it doesn't actually address the fact that women continue to bear that burden. If you want, they do this because they want women to join the labor force. So if you input these things, women will be free to take up paid work, contribute to GDP. And I think it's also important to ask, do women have a choice? Is it that if we provide childcare, elder care, disability care, they must take up paid work? Because I am reminded when we have, particularly even now, the conversation on remittances from women migrant workers, the whole focus is on it has to be invested. Okay, but these are persons who go to improve their standard of living. You know, they build a house, they want to give. So why do we constrain our discussions to women's labor force participation or women's financial contribution that would go towards the national GDP? I'm saying, well, do they have a choice? Can they decide, no, I want to have my money and I want to spend it on this, and I want to be relieved of much of my unpaid care work, and I want to decide whether I want to take up work or not. So I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Yeah, you need to just take that view. Thank you. Do you want to take a seat? Will this be still visible if Sepali sits here? Or there? Okay.
Oh, I have to sit there. Okay.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sepali, and for taking us through a very vast field really well with sort of like, and there's some of those very stark statistics, but we had a session at CSW on Monday, and we were also reflecting on the power of storytelling in actually thinking through what are the dynamics. So that's really powerful. I really also liked how you had the interaction between, you know, the welfare state policy on one hand, etc. And, you know, like we've been grappling with this issue for a while in other countries and other contexts as well, in terms of why, you know, even when women go into the labor force, you know, their housework and their domestic responsibilities don't change. So it's sort of like, so why is it that norms change when it's about women's participation in the market, but don't change when that's about you know, participation at home. But we can discuss that. I just wanted to open it to the floor for comments, thoughts, questions, and also from the online audience. If there's nothing, if there's any questions online, please do put them up, and we'll read them out. Any thoughts? Any things that we can start off discussing?
Yes, I
Yeah.
think so.
I'm still trying to formulate this. Thank you so much for that. And it's always very good, as Deepta said, to be able to get into the details of these. I'm sure you already know that the situation is very similar in the rest of South Asia, if not the rest of the world in many ways, Southeast Asia, across Africa. This is an area that is just where women's labor is not recognized in the way that we would want. I'm just thinking, I mean, coming at it from the rest of South Asia, the picture is particularly dismal. And I'm just wondering about the case of Sri Lanka in particular. Do you see anything changing, especially with your current government? And if we're asking for recognition of the issue, then we're asking for specific things to happen anywhere in there that you see something can shift. Sri Lanka, South Asia, wider than that.
I'll answer this one first. Well, I mean, look, we've had a change of government, and everybody asks this very similar question to that. Can we expect to see positive changes in relation to many things, but in relation to women's work? And I really think that what we need to have is the definition of work that includes unpaid care work. When we say women's labor, we don't include unpaid care labor. So I think, well, given that we had the Prime Minister's speech on Women's Day also was very much based around women's economic participation, women's work, etc. We may have some openings to bring this discussion, to take the discussion further. Apart from that, as long as our welfare programs continue to be be based on the assumption that you can give an allowance, but you don't talk about the carers, then I think, we have a lot of work to do. We may, and anyway, the welfare state, I think Meek can talk about the state for 3 days, Sri Lankan, given the work that you have done. No, I'm just throwing it to you. I'm saying that, yes, our welfare state has changed. It's not the welfare state that we might have had or we aspire to have, but it does continue with certain programs. But sometimes I feel that it's like ticking the box. Yeah, we have a allowance for persons with disability. We have allowance for persons, elderly persons, and you tick the box. It's like we have paternity leave in Sri Lanka. Did you know? 3 days. But we have ticked the box. So that's what we need to push. It's not a case of saying yes at in international fora we have this, that, but what does it mean? How is it effective at a very basic level? And also what does it mean for actually the broader spectrum of care? I hope I answered.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Sepali, I want to approach this from a slightly different angle, but I think it's a useful one. So one thing you did was kind of give us a gender critique of the social welfare system in Sri Lanka. Actually, it's not a very devastating critique. If you were to approach that critique from a class point of view, I think it's a much more powerful critique, and I'll sort of tell you why I think it's more powerful. Okay, the first thing is Sri Lanka, on average, over the last 100 years, has had about twice the per capita incomes of the rest of South Asia. So it's a country that you would expect to have more spending on social welfare of any kind, whatever the inadequacies of spending. And in between the 1940s, and you said till about the end of the 70s, we had that. It was actually very high and quite generous. But then, as you said, but I would like to emphasize, the amount of money spent on social welfare of any kind as a percent of income, percent of GDP plummeted over the next 30 years. I mean, the money really matters here. And we went round from what was, I think, 14% of government expenditure, no more than 14, well over that in the 70s, to some very tiny proportion. And, one of the many dimensions of this, you mentioned the various social welfare programs that were renamed, but one of the features of all of them was one of the biggest items of expenditure was employing people to go around and interfere in people's business and give them a bit of money and tell them to join a savings group or get employed or whatever. So, I mean, it was an employment program for people, for government supporters, as much as it was actually a social welfare program. So that's one kind of critique. I mean, the other point, as you know, it wasn't just the social welfare. Government spending on education has gone down and down. According to one measure, it is now virtually the lowest in the world. I mean, which is devastating for a country of that kind of size. Another dimension of this, is that those people in the employment formal sector, who are mainly men, have been paying into a pension scheme called the EPF, Employees Provident Fund, for a long time. And we now know that government has been manipulating this fund to a very high degree in its own interests and in the interests of influential people, and basically stealing money from the pensioners, who are, an increasing share of the population. And behind all this and the reduced spending is the fact that the ratio of tax to GDP halved over about 30 years. And now, tax as a percent of GDP in Sri Lanka is still amazingly low compared to the income of the country. So, I mean, I accept your gender critique, but I mean, there is a kind of, I think, certainly in quantitative terms, a much bigger story there about class. Which obviously intersects in all kinds of important ways with the gender issues.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for pulling out key aspects of the Sri Lankan economy. I completely agree with you, because but I do think that we have to have gender lens when we are talking about social welfare and households. Because that is something that is not taken in. But when you said in terms of class, I was actually thinking at the other end that these welfare programs are looking at low income, in terms of class, the poorer segments. That is theoretically that's well, it is. Most of the time they are the people who are eligible, and they are the ones who have been able to get something out of it. But I completely agree, and I know that you've been looking at Sri Lankan economy and politics for a long time. The corruption that has gone into even the welfare programs and the poverty alleviation programs in particular. So that's something I think that the country has to deal with, because you can't be pointing to anybody else, but it is part of a political culture and political rule or power that had dominated the country for probably the last 30 years for sure. So yeah, I think we need to look at the aspect of class. We recognize, which I haven't put in here, the what do you got? The it's not a zooming, you can zoom down, no? Of welfare expenditure as per national budget, which is, I think, something that should be included in this kind of discussion, because it is for everybody. When you say the welfare spending has gone down, it's for everybody, but in particular for the poorer households, and then in who is taking the brunt of this. So somebody is doing all this, some other people are benefiting, but we are still in the same kind of gender blind policy making that will say, yes, we have increased the allowances. Yes, girls and boys can go to school. Of course, in Sri Lanka, girls have access. It's a culture that acknowledges and believes that both girls and boys must be educated. So there is no keeping girls at home. But then when you don't have enough money to send all children to go to school, you might choose who is more, would be safer going to school by him or herself, And so those issues are there. And again, another aspect I think is when we have been narrowing in a way, we have been narrowing the eligibility criteria for poverty alleviation, for example, instead of addressing the issue of how much money is actually being given to people who don't deserve that. But when we narrow it down, we actually bring in criteria such as the electricity bill. Now, that was one criteria for this new Aswasuma. Well, very unfortunate for everybody, the Aswasuma Poverty Alleviation Program started to be rolled out in the middle of an economic crisis. When people could not pay an electricity bill, they were saying, okay, we can use the electricity bill, which is very safe, much safer than asking for income. I'm going to say I earn 20 rupees. You're going to say, you're earning 15 rupees a day. So that's not reliable. But then they started roll it out with no actually, I think sensitivity is not an adequate word when you roll out a poverty alleviation program based on criteria that had been done prior to a crisis, and say, well, you're not eligible because you're paying, or next week the electricity bill person has been cut, the connection has been cut. So I think that there are a lot of issues in the way in which these kinds of programs are formulated and implemented, but I think cross-cutting all of those is, we have to look at it from a gender lens.
Thanks.
Anything?
Is there anybody else? Did you want to say something, or?
Yeah. Hello, I'm Naini from Sri Lanka, and I'm interested in smallholder family farming, since Sri Lanka is increasingly dominated by smallholder farming. I just wanted to ask, how does unpaid care work contribute to the sustainability of a smallholder farming households in Sri Lanka, and what are the economic and social consequences of its invisibility in policy and development programs?
So I think it's good because if you look, the question of smallholder farms, is there a definition that women are farmers? Because when I looked at agricultural policy, the form of the agricultural policy that I could access recognizes men as farmers and women as home gardeners, right? So that's something that you can also look at if there has been. So when you have women as home gardeners, but in various conversations or documents, you will have for women farmers. But actually, to what extent, when you say farmers, access to loan facilities for farmers, you have to actually dig in to see how many women farmers are there. The farmer organizations are predominantly male dominated. The women farmers might be a secretary or something, but the chair is always a male. So, okay, given that context. But in smallholder farmings, I think farms, I think if it's a women-headed smallholder farm, that we had to find out. When, of course, yes, she would be the contributor. But most often, she would be contributing to the farm along with, along with unpaid care that she will be doing in the home. So, and I think that's an aspect that you can look at, because we look at small. I suppose you can tell us who or what constitutes a smallholder farm and a farmer. And in terms of the second part of the question was yeah, so we hope, really we are hanging our coats on, okay, 2 or 3 things. One is the research that has to carry on, that has been done, that we are trying to have discussions with policymakers. It's not only policymakers, but it's sometimes even other research, human rights activists. They don't think unpaid care work is something that one should, they think that it's romanticized. And really, you don't need to be talking about it. But we have hanging our one thing is we have to do more evidence-based research and advocacy, which is strong advocacy. The other thing is, the other hook is, of course, it is a lot of responsibility, but we are hopeful that the current Prime Minister can take this forward, by bringing it up as an issue in Parliament, but also inputting for policies that she can input into. Yeah.
So there's a question online where it says, thank you for this discussion. What do you see as the solution? If we increase the allowance or better selection criteria, would it ease women's burden? Could you comment on increasing the availability of affordable services and basic services to reduce the burden on women, and whether that could benefit economic recovery? Or is it less of a priority for the state in this context? Is there a way we can frame this for a government that is so focused on macroeconomic recovery?
I think, just to pick up on some of those aspects in those questions, increasing an allowance and investing in care services is absolutely important. It's essential. And increasing an allowance that is realistic, allowance that would actually enable an elderly person to live comfortably, but increasing an allowance or introducing an allowance for the caregivers within the family. Okay, so in terms of that's there. So allowance and investment in care services is really important, because if we don't have quality care and good quality, what we have are local councils will have daycare centers, but they are so, the funds are so little, it's like barely functioning at any level. You children will be left there. Childcare, Montessori's or things like, they name them that, but all over the country. World Bank did a study on this, where there's no training on the persons of the persons who are giving the teaching or care. So yeah, we need that. And I think when you say a government focused on macroeconomic policies, I think every single government is focused on macroeconomic policies. So we have to take that as a given. If we want the macroeconomic also to include the micro, such as household level and such as care, then I think we need to have those discussions with government.
Great, thank you. Sepali, I think those are questions from the room. Did you have anything? No. Okay. I just wanted to ask you, because as the Sustaining Power program, we're really interested in sort of strategies where women's groups get together. I wanted to ask you a little bit about where you see action in Sri Lanka happening on this issue? Is there a concerted, are there women's groups that are working on either unpaid care or the macroeconomic issue? And how do women's movements how are women's movements really sort of pushing back on these trends?
There has been a lot of demonstrations, particularly in the north and east, on the onslaught of the economic crisis, as well as on the disappeared, as post-war or during the war. So, but because what I have, of course, should also include is the impact of microfinance, which I didn't, but I should have, which I will. Because microfinance agencies have had a devastating effect on low-income households, particularly in the rural areas, and it's the women who take those microfinance loans at exorbitant interest rates. So there have been demonstrations against microfinance agencies, asking for, because they are not regulated. And for the last 10 years, I have heard various policy discussions saying they're going to bring in a policy to rein in the microfinance operations, but it still hasn't been come up. So yes, and those demonstrations have been by women in relation to when the economic crisis really hit. You found women farmers coming out. That was when the agriculture, they stopped the subsidies. So it's not the microfinance protests are organized, right? There are women's groups organizing involved in it. There haven't been so many of those protests in the south, but definitely in the north and the east. But the farmer women who came out to protest the agricultural subsidy removal it was like the first time I saw women. Of course, it's also television that bring them to us. Lots and lots of women. So you can see that it's not that people are just sitting back and taking it, but where women organizers come out mostly are in relation to incidents of violence against women, and I think protests on kind of any other socio-economic issues as well. But those are the ones that most of the time galvanize women into organizing these kinds of protests.
Yeah. So basically,
Can I add to that? Because I'm more optimistic than you are about this.
Okay.
But the political leadership is also changing, and probably in a very positive way. And actually, I think you and I probably agree on this. But until the last election, every political party ruling Sri Lanka was highly male chauvinist. And you see that in the language that's used in parliament. I mean, women are demeaned and they're called prostitutes and, that kind of thing. It was appalling. But at the same time, women are actually more represented in tertiary education than men. So you actually have apparently good record of educating women, but they don't get the jobs, and they had no political power until recently. But I mean, there's been a kind of build-up of this, and I think you can see now in the new government. It's true. I mean, the number of women in parliament doubled from 5 to 10%. That's not very high, but at least it doubled. But it'll probably go up, and the ruling party does, has some quite impressive women there. So I think there's every reason to think that, gender issues are going to get, a better political lead from government, at least from the ruling party, and that we might actually see some quite positive things happening. No?
Thank you. Thank you for your optimism. And I acknowledge the largest number of women elected to parliament from the general elections. And yes, there are very good politically sharp women in that among them. And some of them have also worked on unpaid care work with us. So yes, there is hope. However, we also recently, the government appointed a tourist advisory board, which did not have a single woman. There are many areas where we cannot assume that this gender balance is going to be better. But I think it's something that we have to work on, and I think the women in parliament also will become stronger. They've just been voted in. So I kind of share mixed optimism, though the enthusiasm is very much more over there.
I mean, and I think we've seen this in other countries in South Asia and also the rest of the world, is that while it is important to elect women leaders and have that representation, I think the literature says two things. One, there has to be a critical mass and a critical period over which they are, like you're saying, doing things. But I think what we've seen, especially in contexts of like other countries, Pakistan, a large part of like, where women have come up in Nepal, etc., are where there are very strong grassroots mobilizations. And it's interesting you say that the grassroots mobilizations in Sri Lanka's case are more on issues of domestic violence and things like that, rather than on care. And I think that is an interesting conundrum where unpaid care is considered to be, this is just normal, like it's sort of like it happens. And so I think that is definitely an issue with also the other countries, that if while you elect women in parliament, these issues don't come on before before actually that somebody's holding these elected representatives to account and really kind of saying we need to do this. So there's a lot of activism that's required.
It is required. Because I remember once we had this, is there a question? Let me, no?
Comments, go ahead.
Once we were in, my organization was involved in training groups of women's rights organizations. And so we were covering various themes, and one theme was on unpaid care work and care work rather. And I remember one person said, we should be talking about access to finance and all. Why are we, this is something that we do normally. So it's something that people, you have to really like explain it to them and give the background, because it's not something that people will just say, yes, they will say. But I have to say, when we finished our research, there were many women who told us when we went back, we were going to do the case study, etc. They said, I never knew I did all this work. I didn't know that I did work so many hours. And this was one young woman who said she does everything, like she has a cow, she farms rice, she has chickens, and then she says, well, my husband has a job somewhere. And when he comes home, he brings me an ice cream or something. And so I said, it's nice, but it doesn't take away from the fact that she's does all this work. But 12 hours a day. And that's what she realized after our discussions. She and among, in 6 districts, we had these conversations, and that's the kind of advocacy also we need to do. Yeah.
Absolutely. There is a comment here by someone online who says the vast majority of the bureaucracy are women. The bureaucracy has more say in what happens in the country, in Sri Lanka, than does Parliament. The ruling mercantile class has more control over the bureaucracy than the politicians. So that's just a comment that that they've made.
Noted.
Okay. Okay.
I know that is.
Okay, I was just wanting to say, also thanks to Mary to come in, because I think Mary's worked in Sri Lanka and we didn't know this. And Mary, what you missed was very interesting, that what Sepali said, that caregivers of persons with, in terms of the caregivers of persons with disability, women spend 93% of their time looking after persons with disability, while men only spend 8.8% of their time looking after persons with disability in the household. And like you talked about the isolation, etc.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Mary if you thought that that was also representative of other places where you've done research.
Exacerbated version of the unpaid care situation for women is that if you have a disabled person, whether it's a child or an adult in the home, nearly always, almost 100% of the time, it's the women that do all that caring. And the men quite often say they don't know how to do it, or it's women's work, or I can't do it, or it's embarrassing, or it's too difficult. Or so the women really get sort of physical, emotional, strains and impacts from that on their own health to a large extent. I've just been writing a chapter about this actually, but for a book on care that didn't have a chapter about care of disabled people, but we managed to muscle our way into that book. And so you can't have a book about unpaid care without having a chapter about disability, because it's a really, really heavy burden as it's seen. But actually, if you ask the women themselves, they quite often don't conceptualize it as a burden, because they don't want to think about that family member as burdensome. It's somebody they love. It's whether it's a child or a spouse or another family member who's become disabled. So they say they're doing it out of love and duty. They don't say they're doing it as a burden, but it surely has a heavy impact on their own health and well-being.
Other countries as
well. Yeah, globally, yeah, including in global north countries.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Because the whole concept of care is wedged in with love and duty. And so people just, because some of the women that we spoke with, it's really sad. And no one, also it's your fault, it's your fault you had a disabled child. And like in the discussion earlier, you did something bad in your last birth, or you did something exactly like this, you had an abortion before, and this is why this. So it's always the woman's fault. And in many cases, we also found that the men left.
I was about to say that. Yeah.
They left. They just left the woman. And so she had in one case, she had a disabled child, the elder one. The second one was not disabled, but she had to look after both. And then the younger child has to be in the house with the sister while the mother can go out and do 2 hours of work somewhere, paid work, So after school, when the girl comes home. So there has to be a far more focus on the carers of the elderly and persons with disability and unpaid care work in general.
So the extra thing to say about that is obviously the siblings quite often also become unpaid carers, especially as the parents become older.
Yeah.
And there's an expectation that they'll take over that role when the parents are no more. But also, very often, disabled children don't go to school.
Yeah.
So there's no respite in terms of them going to school. So that mother can't go and do work during school hours even, because the child doesn't go anywhere. The child is in the house all the time. So it's, it's like 24-hour care, whereas other children, you get respite from them, whoever they are, because they do go to school in the daytime, for better or worse. But a lot of, like something like 70% of disabled children globally don't go to school.
Yeah.
So, there's an extra, so you're losing the income that mother might have earned from external work. And And also that person as they grow up, that disabled child as they grow up, is also not going to be an earner. So they, they remain needing care into adulthood. So, or if it's a spouse who's become disabled, you're losing the income of that person. So yeah, has financial impact as well as the physical and emotional impact on them. And the siblings know it's going to come to them to look after that person later on.
I also came across situations where there is a school for children with disabilities, again, depending on the type of disability, but the parents can't send the child because there's no transport. There's no transport that can take this child, in a wheelchair or otherwise, to that school. So that's why then we come, full circle about services that are, multiple types of services that are needed.
It happens.
Yes.
Sometimes if there is a school that will take that child, they'll say we only take the child if a parent sits in the class with the child all day. If the child has learning disabilities or behavioural difficulties, they say, well, we'll have him in the class, but you have to come with him. So you think, well, so how does that work? How do they look after the other children? Or how are that also losing an income because they have to be in school? And I've met families who've done that. So one parent sits in class with the child, massive implications so that's a kind of care in a way, but
of course.
I just wanted to wrap up saying that, Diane Nelson actually says this about love and care is that, that we do it out of love, we do care out of love, but we don't always love to do that work. So I think that's something that is really important to understand. But I was really struck by what also Nick, you said about like the rapid decline in social welfare spending and the fact that education has gone down so drastically as a percentage of GDP is a cause for real concern, but also how then tax has also gone down, and in order to because when we talk about services or advocacy around care services and including infrastructure around like roads and transport facilities, etc., we're always kind of like hit with, well, but we don't have money, and there is no money, and then and now if you put that together with the tax thing, it's really interesting to see how the expenditure on on social welfare services, what is the rate of that decline versus what is the rate of that tax decline, and where is that tax coming from, and so it's a real conundrum to kind of get out of.
I think just to add there, we have welfare budget on social welfare has gone, but what has not gone anywhere is the very high percentage of the national budget that goes to the military.
Oh yeah,
yes.
So there's no question why cannot that be reduced so that this can, so that's something that we really have to also look at. The military budget for the military has been.
Well, we're facing that right. This country. We've cut expenditure on ODA, the cost of defense spending, and that's what is and then how that trickles to.
Social welfare.
And they're supposed to, they're supposedly cutting social welfare, especially for people with disability, and that's just they just made an announcement yesterday, day before yesterday. Yeah, well. Let's see. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Sepali. This has been really good and a pleasure to have you always, because as an alumni, it's really great to have Sepali. So yeah, thanks very much for listening, everybody on the online seminar as well.